The first image that really kicks off our deep dive today is, well, it's brutal. It's this collision of absolute state power and complete innocence.
It really is.
I want you to picture a brilliant Mediterranean morning. You know the kind where the sea is so unbelievably clear you feel like you can see straight to the bottom.
It's still clear.
And as a child, probably a fisherman's son, maybe 8, 9 years old, he's a strong swimmer, he knows the sea, and he's just playing near the shore of his village.
And then the instruments of the state just arrive.
Exactly, and not with, open violence. It's worse. It's this terrifying formality.
Imperial agents, you have local officials with them, and they step ashore holding these official papers.
Stamped with the emperor's seal.
Right. And they're polite, they're meticulous, but they are completely relentless.
They actually measure the child's lung capacity, they check his physical condition, and then it's like a transaction.
It is a transaction. A small sum of money changes hands, the family gets a document promising imperial service.
And they take the child, they put him on a ship, and it heads south.
That cold formality, that administrative layer over something so horrifying, that is the perfect entry point for what we're talking about today.
It's the whole story in a nutshell.
It is, because we are focusing on the island of Capri, specifically around the year 26 AD. And the man behind it all is the emperor himself, Tiberius Julius Caesar Augustus.
Okay, so let's really dig into this. We have this idyllic setting, right? The Bay of Naples, an island paradise.
On the surface, yes.
But our mission today is to look right under that surface. We're focusing on how absolute power in Tiberius's hands used the standard operating procedures of the Roman bureaucracy.
Its logistics, its architects, everything.
To facilitate what was essentially a campaign of systemic, sustained, and really depraved abuse.
And the sources we have here are, well, they're incredibly robust, which is so important. We're not dealing with just whispers or gossip from the marketplace.
Right. This isn't just tabloid history.
Not at all. We have the core accounts from the major chroniclers. You've got Suetonius in Lives of the 12 Caesars, Tacitus in the Annals, and Cassius Dio.
And the crucial part, the thing that makes this so undeniable,
is that their accounts, the specific acts, the logistics they describe, are physically corroborated by the archaeological ruins we can still see on the island today.
That archaeological link is everything.
Yeah.
So our mission then, it isn't just to list the scandals, which, people have been doing for centuries.
We need to move past the sensationalism.
Exactly. We need to understand the institutional machinery behind it. How did Tiberius turn his private cruelty into a state-supported project that was, durable?
Persistent.
That's the question. We're looking at architecture that was repurposed for containment. We're looking at administrative rigor being applied purely for personal pleasure.
And that whole transformation, this merger of infrastructure and malice, it all happened at one key location.
Villa Jovis, the House of Jupiter.
Which sounds grand. It was. It was perched on the highest, most secluded cliff on the eastern side of Capri, about 12 kilometers from the mainland. And this villa, it was engineered to be more than just a home.
It was designed for something else.
It was designed for absolute security, total control, and complete separation from the outside world. It was a fortress, really, but it wasn't built to keep enemies out.
No. It was built to keep secrets and victims in.
Let's start with the political context of this retreat. So Tiberius moves his whole residence to Capri in 26 AD. That's about halfway through his reign.
He doesn't abdicate or anything like that, but he physically withdraws from being in Rome, from the day-to-day rule.
Yeah.
So how did the chroniclers, the historians at the time, see this move?
They saw it as the absolute turning point. Tacitus especially, he frames it as the moment the last bits of, republican virtue and any kind of accountability just vanished.
So the move was supposed to be strategic, to get away from the politics of the capital.
That was the idea, yes, to avoid the political games, the burdens of the city. But all the chroniclers agree that it devolved very, very quickly.
And Suetonius has that phrase for it, right?
He does. He calls it an empire of appetite. The emperor's private wants became the sole focus of the state's administration.
But wait a minute, let's push back on that for a second. When we read these accounts, especially Suetonius, who's writing decades later, how do we know he isn't just exaggerating, painting Tiberius as this unique monster to make later emperors look better?
That's a fair question. It's a fundamental question of historical method, really.
Doesn't the sheer luridness of some of it make you skeptical?
It should. And that's precisely why we have to look past simple rumor and focus on the convergence of the evidence.
Okay.
Tacitus, for example, he was an experienced senator. He'd seen the political consequences of Tiberius's reign, and he had access to the official records.
And Suetonius.
Suetonius was a librarian, a scholar. He collected very specific facts, even if his presentation was, a bit stark. They aren't just repeating gossip. They're citing records, specific logistical details that, and this is the key, they align with the physical evidence we find on the ground.
So it's not just Tiberius was a bad guy.
Here are the mechanics of what he did. Suetonius gives technical details that you would only know if you had access to intimate staff reports or actual witnesses.
Okay, so let's pivot from the accounts to the stage itself. Village Otis, the architecture of control. The island is already naturally fortified with these steep cliffs. How did Roman engineering take that to the next level?
They took it to a whole other level. The location was picked for maximum defensibility and I would argue maximum invisibility from the mainland.
It's on the summit of Mount Tiberia.
Exactly. And the archaeological reports show us how the construction turned those natural barriers into a perfect security system. The main entrances were these narrow single gates. They were designed to funnel everything, people, supplies, everything, past multiple layers of guards.
So you're controlling all movement.
Every single movement.
Yeah.
And the approach roads were built with these really controlled sightlines. Guards in specific watchtowers could see the entire route up from the harbor, but you couldn't easily see them from below.
Total surveillance. It's not just about privacy then, it's about managing who sees what.
It's about managing information flow. Absolutely. And that brings us to the core infrastructure of the abuse. The water systems.
Right. Roman hydraulic engineering was, it was incredible.
It was extraordinary. And on this dry volcanic island, it's just astonishing. The key to the whole operation, especially these bathing rituals, was this massive system of cisterns cut directly into the living rock.
So they're capturing rainwater.
Capturing rainwater, but they were also multi-tier, highly specialized. They were designed to feed all these different pools and baths with water of, different temperatures, different depths.
What kind of capacity are we talking about?
Estimates put the main cisterns at thousands of cubic meters. It's a massive feat of engineering just to supply this one sequestered operation.
But how are they heating and cooling all this water on a cliff face? That's got to be a complex hypocaust system.
It is. The ruins showed tons of evidence of hypocausts. The Roman underfloor heating running right underneath the private bathing suites.
Which would have required a huge amount of labor.
An enormous logistical operation. You'd have slaves constantly feeding furnaces, managing airflow just to keep these temperatures constant. And the pools themselves, they were enclosed, marble-lined, and specifically segmented.
So not just for swimming?
Not at all. Some were standard depth, sure. But others had these submerged passages and benches. They were designed for very specific, sustained aquatic maneuvers, not for laps.
You mentioned something earlier that I find just deeply disturbing, the acoustic containment.
Yeah.
How did the architecture actually, muffle the sounds?
It's a combination of the materials and the location. Marble, when you use it on all the walls and floors, is actually really effective at damping sound waves. It just eats noise. And on top of that, the private bathing areas were set deep into the core of the villa, surrounded by these heavy stone walls and earthworks. And then there's the water itself.
Right. Water carries sound differently.
Especially above the surface. So the use of submerged passages was deliberate. The entire environment was engineered to allow these long, uninterrupted sessions while neutralizing any audible sound of distress that might carry to the rest of the staff quarters.
It's chilling. So let's identify the victims of this engineered isolation. The sources use these specific chilling terms.
They do. The documentation makes a clear distinction between the general staff and the specific groups selected for the emperor's pleasure.
We have the term spintri.
Yes, which refers to selected young men, probably adolescents and young adults. They were involved in a whole range of activities, often forced participation in these elaborate rituals.
But the focus of this specific aquatic cruelty was another group.
The parvuli, which literally translates to the little fishes. This term was used specifically for young boys, often prepubescent, who were trained for these acts inside those marble pools.
And the chroniclers are very specific about the acts themselves, which just confirms why they needed these highly engineered pools.
They are disturbingly specific. Suetonius, in his catalogue of Tiberius's depravities, says that the boys, the parvuli, were trained to perform these underwater maneuvers between the emperor's thighs.
So participating in acts of forced sexual service.
And amusement, yes.
Wow.
Tacitus is maybe a bit less graphic on the mechanics of it, but he catalogues this entire period as one of profound moral degradation. He basically says the emperor was consuming the life force of the youth to satisfy his own decaying imperial virtue.
The structural connection is what makes this a system, not just an anecdote. The dimensions of the pools, the control over the water temperature, the submerged passages, none of that was an accident.
None of it.
Oh.
It was a precise, expensive, logistically nightmarish stage built for a very specific, repulsive routine. The architecture wasn't just containment.
It was a blueprint for the abuse itself.
It proves that this behavior was sustained. It was repeated. It required institutional maintenance. You do not build a vast, expensive complex like this on a remote cliff for a one-off act. You build it because you intend for this routine to be a major, long-term feature of your daily life.
Supported by a competent, loyal staff.
Which brings us to the truly chilling part of this whole story. The logistics.
This wasn't just some random opportunistic act of a tyrant. This is a methodical procurement system.
Embedded directly into the mechanisms of imperial command. This is where we have to move beyond the simple story of one wicked man and into the machinery of the state itself.
So the emperor's personal desires were basically translated into official state mandates.
Exactly. And the procurement was handled by two key groups. You had imperial agents operating under official decree, and then you had this vast infrastructure of procurators and the emperor's freedmen's networks.
Okay, let's clarify those roles for everyone listening. What exactly is a procurator doing here, and why were the freedmen so critical to this?
So a procurator was essentially a financial administrator, a provincial manager. They handled imperial property, taxes, specific government jobs. Their involvement here means that this procurement was funded and officially recorded as a state expense.
So it's on the books.
It's on the books. And the freedmen, they were often former slaves who'd gained their freedom but still had this immense personal loyalty to the emperor. They operated outside the rigid hierarchies of the Senate or the military.
Which made them perfect for this kind of sensitive, clandestine work.
Perfect. They managed the entire supply chain, the boats, the transport, the payments, and ensuring total, absolute discretion.
So these agents, they aren't showing up dressed like pirates. They're presenting themselves as legitimate recruiters.
For imperial service, a prestigious, if very vaguely defined, opportunity. They were using the full weight and authority of Rome to enforce compliance.
They'd arrive in these coastal towns, these fishing villages, especially around the Bay of Naples, where families were often poor.
And they came armed with documents, official mandates, the kind of thing a parent would not dare to question. The papers promised opportunity, but what they really did was legitimize the seizure.
And insulate the agents from any kind of local interference.
Exactly. So the parents, they weren't presented with a ransom demand. They were presented with a price, a transaction.
Often framed as a stipend or compensation for the child's service.
And refusal was, as you can imagine, dangerously difficult.
Because you're not just saying no to one guy, you're defying an imperial mandate.
Tacitus makes it clear that any resistance could escalate very quickly. These agents had direct access to local military commanders and, crucially, the Imperial Navy patrolling the coast.
So if a family resisted,
The full weight of the state could come down on them. Detention, seizure of property, even execution for treason. The parents were basically forced to take a small payment to save themselves from total ruin.
and the criteria for selection, it suggests a horrifying, almost industrial level of detail.
Absolutely. The accounts are all consistent. Boys generally between 8 and 14. They had to show exceptional physical aptitude, strong swimmers, physically attractive, and with the lung capacity to hold their breath for a long time.
It's a functional specification, a list of requirements to perform these highly specialized acts.
It wasn't arbitrary at all. It was operational.
And this level of detail suggests there must have been extensive administrative documentation.
Yeah.
Even if the archives are lost, what do the chroniclers say about the ledgers and records?
They confirm this whole operation was accounted for. They reference ledgers recording imperial expenses and what they would euphemistically call human resources.
Like a budget line item.
A detailed, ongoing budget line item. We have inscriptions and references that suggest allocations for the specialized transport, for the compensation paid to families, and for the ongoing maintenance, food, clothing, attendance, once the children were on Capri.
So this wasn't some shadow economy.
Not at all. It was a sustained budget item within the imperial household accounts, all managed by the procurators.
The moment of selection, upon arrival on the island, must have just been the ultimate act of dehumanization. Who did these examinations?
The initial selection was rigorous and clinical. It was performed by highly skilled medical professionals, usually Greek physicians.
And these weren't just any doctors.
No, Greek medicine, especially from places like Alexandria, was considered the height of sophistication. But here, that expertise was completely perverted. They weren't there to provide care.
They were there to grade performance.
Exactly. They examined breathing, flexibility, teeth, general condition. Their notes weren't case files for healing. They were performance metrics for exploitation.
So they're keeping these detailed notes.
Grading the physical aptitude, and those notes fed into a registry, a catalog of human resources, stratified by their utility to the emperor. Those who passed were sent to specialized quarters for training.
And this leads to that chilling bureaucratic detail. Those who failed or got sick or just didn't comply, they didn't just get sent home, they vanished.
And that word, vanished, has a documented bureaucratic footprint that is just horrifying.
What do you mean by that?
When a person became inconvenient, their removal was managed through administrative euphemisms. The chroniclers say the imperial records would have notes like transfer for reassignment or removed from service.
Or even more chillingly,
Transferred to a non-existent province. These entries were a way of ritually cleaning the records. Human life was literally turned into an entry on a tablet, allowing the bureaucracy to manage a child's disappearance without leaving a trail of murder.
it maintains the fiction of clean imperial efficiency.
The administrative effort, just to hide the truth, tells you everything you need to know about the institutional commitment to the system. It required the cooperation of scribes, administrators, doctors, everyone, to maintain that veil.
We required what you might call administrative competence.
And the success of the cruelty relied entirely on the meticulousness of that record-keeping and the procedural language they used to neutralize the reality of it all.
So once they were acquired and selected, these children were immediately put into this rigorous training and psychological conditioning. This was more than just physical. It was about institutionalizing total submission.
That's right. The recruits entered a world that was governed entirely by specific learned routines. The first lessons were procedural.
Like what?
Absolute silence. Strict adherence to a schedule that was dictated entirely by the emperor's whim. And the big one, the institutional rule of avoiding eye contact with the emperor.
And these rules weren't just, organic, they were codified.
They were passed down through example and through swift correction by the villa attendants, and tragically, often by the older, more hardened boys who were already there.
That creates this institutional culture of complicity among the coerced.
It does. Older boys became these tragic intermediaries. We have these little references to figures like a Marcus or a Licinus, boys who had survived for years and understood the brutal math of survival.
And they would teach the newcomers.
They taught them how to move without making a sound, how to manage their breathing, how to maintain a blank expression. It's a form of emotional self-erasure that was necessary just for basic survival.
And the physical training that was geared specifically towards the aquatic demands. I imagine it was grueling.
Intense and highly focused. They were being trained for sustained underwater activity. The pools were connected by submerged passages, so recruits had to learn to move significant distances without surfacing.
Who are the trainers?
Professionals, likely former military trainers or maybe even Laniste gladiator trainers repurposed for this. They focused relentlessly on breath control, working the boys up from short submersions to holding their breath for several minutes.
What's the target?
Often 4 to 5 minutes, pushing the absolute limits of human endurance.
Suetonius called it instituted instruction. That sounds like more than just swimming. It sounds like choreography.
It implies a formalized discipline, yes. The boys were taught specific ritual movements, circles, dives, gestures, all timed precisely to the emperor's position in the water. These were disciplined, forced performances. Any deviation could be seen as insubordination.
The atmosphere of the sessions themselves must have been psychologically suffocating. The emperor's presence dictated everything, blurring day and night.
Tiberius's body, his mood, his tiniest gestures, that became the ultimate terrifying clock. The boys learned to read every subtle signal, a shift in his weight, a tightening of his jaw, the way his fingers stilled.
A slow wave could mean a session would drag on for hours.
A shift in his breathing dictated if they were performing correctly. Their immediate fate, a reward, a reprimand, or worse, was tied to their ability to perfectly interpret his physical cues.
Which creates this perverse meritocracy. Obedience buys you a tiny bit of reprieve, but not dignity.
That's the psychological terror of it. A boy who pleased the emperor might get a small privilege, a slightly cleaner bed, better rations for the day, maybe protection from the harsher attendants.
But those gains were completely dependent on continued submission.
And could be withdrawn in an instant. They were powerful incentives within this closed system, ensuring compliance not through loyalty but through manufactured desperate self-interest.
And punishment was immediate and bureaucratic. It was logged as part of the routine.
Swift and institutionalized. Denying a request or failing one of the performance measures logged by the physicians meant an immediate loss of rations or isolation.
Crying out, showing any distress.
Resulted in being moved to specific isolation chambers. The chroniclers describe these as places of psychological torture, where the only sound was the relentless, rhythmic dripping of water, a form of dread-inducing sensory deprivation.
And the worst sanctions involved a move from the controlled world of the pools to the darkest parts of the complex.
Exactly. The sanctions were designed to break you psychologically. Public shaming, immersion in freezing baths, or, most terrifyingly, being taken to the subterranean areas.
These were rooms guarded by the men who also guarded the villa's deepest secrets.
And they housed implements or were the scene of acts that, as the sources say, no one wanted to see again. Tacitus, referencing records, noted the grinding normality of these transactions. Severe punishment was just logged as a routine disciplinary measure.
That normalization is everything. Going back to the idea of complicity, the older boys teaching survival. It demanded they mimic pleasure or mask their suffering. What was the emotional toll of that?
The emotional economy was entirely counterfeit. Praise from the emperor was like fake currency, offering a flicker of perceived safety. The system taught these children to read his face not for human connection, but purely as a threat assessment. Their survival hinged on their capacity for emotional dishonesty.
We've mentioned the Greek physicians a few times. Let's dig deeper into their role. They weren't just examiners.
They were absolutely critical to the whole system. They were skilled in breath control, bathing therapies, so they doubled as medical attendants. And they kept these detailed logs.
Referencing lung capacity, reaction to temperature, stamina.
But this medical data wasn't used to treat them. It was used to feed the central selection registry. If a boy's health declined, if his capacity to hold his breath decreased, what they logged as declining aptitude.
He was retired from service.
And effectively made to vanish. Their procedural language, using clinical terms like suitable aptitude or trained subject, completely stripped away any human dignity. It framed these children as specialized, disposable resources.
It's the ultimate example of high-level expertise being systematically abused to maintain a horrifying regime.
That procedural distance is what insulated the administrators from the moral weight of what they were doing. They were just inputting data, managing assets, administering procedures. It turns monstrous acts into mundane routine.
It's easy to see the Capri era as just Tiberius retiring to indulge himself. But he was still running the empire from that island. How does that work? And how is this abuse tangled up with his actual political survival?
He never abandoned the throne. He governed through constant correspondence, issuing decrees, managing appointments, receiving envoys in these highly orchestrated meetings.
So his withdrawal just shifted the daily governance to a small circle of proxies in Rome.
Exactly. A narrow circle of highly trusted commanders, equestrian aides, and his loyal freedmen. The cruelty on the island wasn't separate from the state. It was conducted by the very same networks and systems that specialized in state secrecy and imperial enforcement.
So the political context matters because it confirms the sheer scale of the operation.
Precisely. This system of procurement, transport, and staffing on Capri required constant support from the political infrastructure. The cruelty was sustained because the mechanisms designed to ensure imperial control, the naval routes, the secure communication lines, were all repurposed to serve Tiberius's personal needs.
The execution of Sejanus in 31 AD must have been a pivotal moment. Sejanus was his powerful Praetorian prefect in Rome.
A monumental shock. Sejanus had effectively been running things while Tiberius was away. His execution triggered immense paranoia in Tiberius. It confirmed all his deepest fears about those closest to him.
And that purge rippled directly into the household on Capri.
It did. Tiberius began to question the loyalty of every freedman, every attendant, every official reporting to him, fearing they might have been one of Sejanus's agents.
And how did that political paranoia translate into increased cruelty for the Parvuli and the staff?
Well, paranoia demands secrecy, and secrecy demands absolute control. The purges in Rome led to tighter security on Capri, more arbitrary punishments for tiny infractions, and this increased need to ensure that no secrets ever left the island.
So the line between political security and personal sadism just blurred completely.
It vanished. The cruelty intensified as the emperor sought absolute psychological and physical control over his immediate environment.
And we have to keep coming back to the fact that the logistical details confirm this was systemic. The household accounts, even what we have left of them, show this was a sustained, expensive project.
It was a sustained budget item. Allocations for specialized clothing, food, the maintenance of the quarters. They were constant. This proves the procurement men weren't rogue actors. They were officials using public resources, state ships, state funds, state mandates, for a private imperial demand.
So the machinery of abuse was durable because it was just absorbed into the bureaucracy.
It was managed with bureaucratic competence, yes.
Which means the sanctions weren't just disciplinary, they were a form of sophisticated psychological warfare.
Designed to isolate, to confuse, and to destroy the will to resist. Things like sleep deprivation, extreme temperature shocks with the hot and cold baths, deep isolation.
And for those who dissented or tried to escape, the administrative route was key.
They were made to disappear through the ritual of reassignments, not an open trial. Tacitus notes that many people servants, officials, and by implication, the children vanished during this era without any formal legal record. The imperial household had become a law unto itself.
Let's talk about that story of Marcus, the older boy who had survived for years. His final refusal really shows the lethal nature of that world.
Marcus was one of the survivors. He was teaching the younger ones the rules. He had tolerated the submission for years, but then he was ordered to participate in a session with some newly procured, much younger boys.
And he refused.
He refused. It was this moment of profound moral courage against a completely insurmountable system. The guards found his bed empty the next morning.
His body was found below the western terraces.
Yes. Villa Jovis is all sheer drops. The topography of the place, the cliffs, the few access points, trying to escape was almost a guaranteed death sentence. His death highlights the total imprisonment, both psychological and physical.
Death was the only way to refuse the emperor's will.
It was the only escape route.
The chroniclers noted the psychological toll on any survivors who were later released or transferred. They described listlessness, withdrawal, loss of appetite.
Which are direct correlates to our modern understanding of profound trauma. They weren't just victims, they were these compromised assets, bearing memories and physical marks that could never be erased. Their trauma made it incredibly difficult to reintegrate into Roman society.
Finally, as Tiberius got older, his physical health declined. Chronic coughs, skin problems, GI issues, but this didn't lessen his demands. It made them worse.
It intensified them. His physicians, trying to give him some relief, devised longer, more elaborate bathing rituals. These rituals required the boys to be submerged for even longer periods. Participating in these complex exercises meant to distract or soothe the emperor.
Suetonius is clear about this.
He is. The decline of the emperor's body required an increase in the consumption of the boys' bodies as a kind of twisted remedy.
And the household adapted structurally to this decline.
Absolutely. We see archaeological evidence of reconfigured pools, temporary partitions being added, attendants being reorganized to manage these marathon rituals. The logic was clear. The more the emperor suffered and the more he needed, the further the institution would normalize extremes.
Long before the chroniclers wrote all this down, news must have reached Rome in whispers. Tiberius's opponents used these stories of Capri as political leverage, right? Painting him as a monster.
They did.
But why was accountability completely paralyzed?
Fear. Simple, paralyzing fear. Even from a distance, Tiberius had the absolute authority to ruin careers and execute opponents through his agents in Rome. The very administrative and naval systems that supported the abuses on Capri were the same ones that prevented any senator or magistrate from launching a serious inquiry.
His authority kept the system that should have punished him in a state of permanent paralysis.
Exactly. So the chronicles, writing decades later, they get access to archives, to oral testimony, and they use this scandal not just as gossip, but as a deep moral and political analysis.
Their goal was to explain how the unchecked private appetite of an emperor could lead to public ruin.
They were critiquing absolute power. They were showing Rome that the state's political decay was perfectly mirrored in the emperor's private corruption, and they were using documented facts to make that moral argument.
And this brings us right back to the convergence of evidence, the synergy between what the texts say and what the stones of Village Ovis tell us. Archaeology gives it this cold, undeniable clarity.
It does. The ruins are the material proof. They force a modern historian to take the textual accounts seriously. When you excavate the remains of the massive cisterns, the engineered terraces, the complex plumbing for heating and cooling water, those details transform the historical claim from an anecdote into materiality.
Can you give a specific example of that convergence?
Okay, think about the heating systems for the pools. The chroniclers describe the parvuli in long sessions in varying temperatures. The archaeological maps confirm these huge, high-capacity furnaces and hypercost channels located specifically under the private bathing suites.
So the engineering was built to facilitate exactly what the sources describe.
Exactly. And then you have things like the frescoes. You see these images of sea nymphs and aquatic scenes, which you might dismiss as just decoration. But they take on a profoundly darker context when you see them right next to the small, windowless rooms that were designed for confinement.
So modern historians, when they weigh all these sources, the core claims, specifically about the little fishes, they survive scrutiny.
They survive because of the redundancy of the evidence. You have multiple independent strands all pointing in the same direction. The specific descriptions in the text, the bureaucratic language of transfers, and the highly specialized, costly architecture required to do those exact things. It elevates the story from invective to documented, systemic history.
Let's talk about the aftermath. For the victims, for the structures of power. After Tiberius dies in 37 AD, the villa is sealed, records are hidden, the staff scattered.
And new emperors, like Caligula, they wanted political continuity. Protecting the structures of rule meant choosing silence over accountability. The imperial prerogative, the idea that the sovereign is above the law, was reinforced by that silence. The same systems that managed the procurement now managed the cover-up.
And the survivors faced this legal and social limbo. What did that mean under Roman law?
It meant they had almost no recourse. The emperor was shielded from any civil or criminal suit. Even if a survivor tried to pursue justice, the political machine that had seized them in the first place could easily suppress it. The state managed the crime, and the state managed the impunity.
Families were compensated with small sums, maybe a bit of status, but that was about buying silence, not about repair.
It was an administrative closure that offered no genuine redress. Survivors suffered economic dislocation, they couldn't go back to their old lives, and this profound social exclusion, their specialized skills, trained for the emperor's private amusements, made them unemployable and deeply stigmatized.
Modern scholarship helps us analyze those historical descriptions of what happened to them.
By applying modern clinical understandings of PTSD, the reported symptoms of withdrawal, listlessness, loss of appetite, even documented suicides, we can strongly argue for enduring injury. The ancient chroniclers were describing a pattern of suffering that aligns perfectly with the devastating effects of long-term trauma.
So we circle back to the central finding of this whole deep dive. The abuses on Capri were not just accidental depravity, not the solitary madness of one man.
No, they were organized, they were recorded, and they were facilitated by an entire imperial machine. The historical truth is one of distributed responsibility. The chain of complicity ran through the whole administrative infrastructure.
The coastal procurators signing the warrants.
The ship captains transporting the cargo, the physicians grading their breathing, the scribes logging their names in the household accounts. The systematic nature of the crime is the defining element.
The paradox of Rome is just laid bare here. The same genius that built the aqueducts and administered sophisticated law also managed the systematic commodification of human life when that was the emperor's will.
Roman grandeur and Roman depravity weren't separate things. They were woven together through the efficiency of the state machine.
We began with that image of a child seized from the sea, taken under the guise of opportunity. And we end, I think, with the understanding that the story of Capri is really a masterclass in how systemic abuse takes root. It's what happens when institutions translate personal perversion into competent project management.
Using state resources and bureaucratic routines to make horror sustainable.
The stones of Villa Jovis, the engineered terraces, the ruins of those pools, they stand today as cold, material evidence. They're permanent in a way that the human testimony of the victims, the parvuli, can never be.
And we have this detailed, painful knowledge of what happened within those walls, but there's no mechanism for redress. There's no way to restore what was taken. We have historical knowledge, but we have it without justice.
That really compels us to reflect on the difficult choices the societies make about which parts of the past to confront. We have to look at the convergence of the testimony and the ruins, because the systems that allowed this administrative commodification of human beings under absolute authority, those are what truly endured long after Tiberius was gone.
That infrastructure of control, that capacity for bureaucratic cruelty, that remains a haunting historical lesson. The moral architecture of Rome allowed the emperor to operate beyond the law, but that doesn't place him, or the system he commanded, beyond our moral assessment.
So the final thought isn't just about Tiberius himself.
No. The truly provocative thought we have to carry forward is not simply why Tiberius demanded these acts, but why so many sophisticated professional administrators, scribes, doctors, financial officers participated with such competence, why they ensured the systematic nature of the crime and its documentation. That level of administrative complicity, that's the mechanism we have to continually study and confront.